Welcome back to the Adventist History Podcast. This episode is called Desmond Ford Part 8, because apparently this series is never going to end. I think this was about the time of the year I said back in the winter or spring that we would be done with Season 2. I thought the Desmond Ford episodes would be maybe 4 or 5 parts, and that would be the end of it. But Part 8, yeah, let's just keep going and see where we get to. Okay, last time we talked about Desmond Ford's time in America, teaching at Pacific Union College. This was in California. Pacific Union College is still in California, but this is when Des moved to California. While in America, he lived in two worlds, the one where some people thought he was a heretic, and the other world where people saw him as an in-demand Adventist preacher who is proclaiming the gospel and the soon return of Jesus and all of that. While Des made some attempt at not provoking the traditionalists who disagreed with him, it happened anyway. In the autumn of 1979, Des was invited to speak at a meeting of the Association of Adventist Forums on the subject of the investigative judgment. And that's where we left you off, a little bit of a cliffhanger there. But I don't know how you resolve a cliffhanger. Is it like a cliff unhanger, a cliff climber-upper? I don't know. We're climbing up the cliff today, though. Okay. So in that last episode, I mentioned that one of the local Adventist Forum leaders was Wayne Judd, a colleague of Des's at PUC, that's Pacific Union College. Now, before I share some promised clips from Des's forum presentation, I'm very excited to do that today, I do want to back up and share a little bit of the story from Wayne Judd's view. Now, Judd's view is important, but not just because he played a pivotal role in inviting Des to give this fateful speech. Judd's view is important because I think he represents something beyond the progressive camp that agreed with Des Ford and the traditionalists who disagreed with Des Ford. This third group that Wayne Judd represents are the scholarly types. They're usually scholarly types, otherwise intellectual Adventists who sympathize with Desmond Ford's views, but for one reason or the other could not fully support him. Maybe they had some important disagreements on a few points here and there, but otherwise they were in sympathy with Desmond Ford. Certainly they did not want to give aid and comfort to what they saw as the reactionary forces arrayed against Desmond Ford. They valued things like academic freedom. They wanted the ability to study these things, and so from their perspective, Des was, a defender of academic freedom, right? By protecting him, we protected our academic freedom. And so even if they had some reservations, maybe they thought Des's understanding of justification was too narrow or incomplete in some way, nevertheless, they broadly supported him, if not in every particular. So this third group is kind of like an allied group with Des, but not necessarily on the exact same team. And I think this matters because it's good that we prevent ourselves from seeing a polarized Adventism at this time. It was polarizing in the sense that two camps were well formed and articulate and loud and insistent that there's only two ways to view this issue. It's important to understand there were some who existed outside of that warped, polarized atmosphere who didn't want to get agitated, activated by the controversy, and who had some, at least in their view, they had some perspective on it all. They could step back and look at the progressives and look at the traditionalists and have conversations about how things were going without being in the fray. All right, this is how they see themselves. They're not in the fray. So I guess what I'm saying is not everybody at that time was either a progressive or a traditionalist. Some did not want to conceive of themselves as being a part of this debate. They had thoughts and opinions and beliefs about this debate between the progressives and traditionalists, but didn't see themselves as a part of it. And Wayne Judd represents one of those groups that didn't see themselves as a part of it. They often seemed like closet progressives. Ford often talked about the number of scholars who agreed with him, but who, for whatever reason, didn't come out and stand by him. And I think many of the times he's really talking about this group. All right, so there's some truth to that, of them being closet progressives, but it's certainly not the whole story. Now, Wayne Judd recounts how PUC's president, Jack Castle, approached him one day and asked, quote, "Wayne, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't bring Desmond Ford in as a guest lecturer. Do you?" End quote. According to Judd, Castle went on to add to that, quote, "We're pretty secure here at PUC. Let's give the Australians some time to cool down." End quote. And for those of you who know what's going to happen, Jack Castle's comment, both of those sentences, just 1,000% wrong. Okay, he's not batting 50 here. He's not right on one of those sentences and wrong on the other. We're pretty secure here at PUC. That is not going to turn out to be the case. Let's give the Australians some time to cool down. That is not going to be the case. Judd writes, quote, "When Des arrived, I knew in our first handshake that the college was in for a rough ride. I responded that I was pleased to meet him too, and I was. I liked Des, and we became good friends. But then came the initial amber light. 'You Americans are far too congenial,' he said. It seemed like an unusual thing to say on our first meeting." End quote. Now let's keep in mind that Judd is writing this many years later with the benefit of hindsight and also with the pain of the Ford crisis in mind. In other words, looking back and seeing all the pain that it has brought you, you might be more inclined to emphasize reservations that you felt about Desmond Ford that maybe you weren't really aware of at the time. Now, maybe he was, okay? Maybe he did see that as an amber light, not quite a red light, but an amber light that was going to cause some trouble. Or maybe this is hindsight kicking in, inflating small details that didn't seem significant at the time. Regardless, Judd represents those who liked Des personally and even admired his theology, but who had significant reservations, whether that was a theological reservation or maybe they just didn't want to join Des and contribute to the polarized vortex that seemed to follow Desmond Ford wherever he went. There's probably a number of reasons why they didn't straight up join Desmond Ford. Judd's comment about Ford's blunt approach to things was a realization, I think, that to throw in with Ford's theology was in some way to throw in with Ford's personality, and it didn't seem like Ford's bluntness was going to help things. Now, Judd will say this later on in his memoirs, that Ford was a very congenial man, and in the aftermath of Glacier View, he said, while Ford was a very congenial man, many of his followers were not, and they would write some really pointed letters and make some comments that did not help things. Now, Wayne Judd had no particular love for the sanctuary doctrine as it was traditionally understood in Adventism. He called Ford convincingly revisionistic on the topic, and Judd wanted others to hear Ford develop and make his case to them. It was expected to be a small gathering of intellectuals. In the afternoon of October 27th, Des told his wife, Jillian, "Nobody will come out for this." Judd and his fellow organizers seemed to have the same expectations. This was a scholarly meeting, after all. Des would present a paper, someone would give a response, there would be some Q&A afterwards. These sorts of meetings were always in the interest of a minority of people on any campus. The forum organizers thought along the same lines, which is why they selected a classroom in PUC's music building that seated a grand total of 25 people. But there was a student on campus at the time, and this student told me, I interviewed him, that the student body knew this was going to be a big speech. As he put it, quote, "Everybody had a sense something is about to happen," end quote. This student said he called Herb Douglas the day before Des' speech and invited him to attend. Herb Douglas was a couple of hours down the road at Mountain View, but Douglas declined to come. According to this student, Douglas told him that Desmond is crafty. The student asked, quote, "You don't think he'll get up and endorse Brinsmead?" End quote. "No," Herb Douglas said, "he'll never do anything like that. You're going to have to smoke him out of his lair." The student claims that Desmond told someone the day before the debate, quote, "What I say tomorrow will be heard around the world," end quote. So how do we make sense of this? How is it that Des can be quoted as saying he didn't think anyone would come to this meeting, and he could be quoted as saying that what he said was going to be heard around the world? How could Wayne Judd and the other forum organizers think that very few people would come when Desmond Ford was the hottest potato in town? Des routinely addressed crowds in the hundreds and thousands, after all. Judd claims that they didn't advertise the meeting very much, yet a number of people showed up with tape recorders, a sign that they believed hundreds and perhaps thousands of people would want copies of these tapes to listen to later. Okay? This is not like pulling out your iPhone and hitting the record button and doing a voice memo of something you realize might be a significant conversation. It took a little premeditation to grab your tape recorder back then and bring it to the meeting. Okay, I would imagine, they had to have planned to bring their tape recorder, knowing that the topic and the speaker were going to collide and produce a historic moment that they wanted to make sure was captured. So how is it some students realized that, but the organizers of the event did not? Surely there had to be some kind of buzz on campus. And I'm not under any illusions that every student was interested in this. I think, as in many things, we tend to focus on the people in the storm, in a debate, in a controversy, whatever. And we'd often don't realize that, the vast majority of people don't care. But, okay, on this campus, there were people who cared. There were a lot of people who cared because they showed up. And some of them brought tape recorders. So how did this buzz on campus not make its way to the organizers? How did they fail to get a sense of what's going on? That's the question I have. That's the question I wish I could ask. And ultimately, it's really a fruitless question because no matter what the answer is, it doesn't really change anything. Now, it's just remarkable to me that they didn't realize how big this was going to be. Now, whether Des knew how big this was going to be, given the two ways he's quoted here, one in one direction, one in the other, again, it's also hard to say. You would think Des would know how many people would want to come hear him speak about this topic. But I do incline myself to thinking that he didn't realize how big this was going to be, and maybe he, like Wayne Judd, should have realized how big this was going to be. The reason why I think that he didn't realize how big this was going to be is because I don't think he would have said what he wrote in his presentation that we're about to hear if he knew 1,000 people and not a small group of scholars were going to be his audience. And I think that's where Des's regret is later on, that the presentation was tuned, I think, for a scholarly audience, a small scholarly audience. It was not tuned for the Adventist public. And so given that that's his regret later on, I think he wrote his presentation thinking it was going to be addressed to a small scholarly audience. Okay. So, as you can imagine, this music room, this room in the music building, I should say, that sat 25 people, immediately filled up. Wayne Judd looked out the window to see hundreds more coming towards the building. He later wrote, quote, "This reservation betrayed my complete ignorance of Des Ford's star power," end quote. The forum organizers thought quickly on their feet. They switched gears. They steered the throng up the main artery of campus towards Irwin Hall's chapel, which could happily seat 1,000 people. Now, the student that I mentioned earlier, he came with his friends. They rushed up the hill to make sure they get good seats. I mean, they knew this is going to be some Adventist theater here, right? Now they're not looking at this with some kind of relish. There's a heaviness to them because they belong to the traditionalists, but they know they want good seats for this. And this student was joined, as I said, by some close friends who are today in positions of influence in the church. And no, I will not name them. I will only say the student had a clipboard to take notes. We'll leave his friends out of the rest of the story. Okay, so Adrian Zykowski, Wayne Judd, Charles Scriven, these are the three forum organizers. They stepped onto the stage with Desmond Ford and Eric Syme, who was the chair of the history department and who had been asked to give the formal response to Ford's presentation. Remember, this is how many of these scholarly meetings work. When you have a keynote like this, someone's going to respond to it. And then the most monumental scholarly presentation in Adventist history began. The organizers had wanted Des to speak to the question. If you'll recall from the last episode, that question was the investigative judgment, new theological truth, or historic necessity. In other words, as I take the question, was the investigative judgment actually true, something that was revealed in the 19th century, or was it a giant face-saving device, as Walter Martin and Donald Barnhouse had said during the 1950s? Is it a giant face-saving device to explain the Great Disappointment? Okay, now, for the sake of those who are a little foggy in Adventist theology, let's revisit our terms here. What is the investigative judgment? What is the sanctuary message? What are we talking about here? The investigative judgment is, I would say, a part of what Adventists call the sanctuary doctrine or the sanctuary message. Richard Davidson, a man I consider the church's foremost scholar on the sanctuary doctrine right now, wrote that, quote, the sanctuary message is not just one doctrine among many in the Seventh-day Adventist theology. The sanctuary is the center of all the major doctrinal truths in the Bible, end quote. The investigative judgment aspect of the sanctuary doctrine is that on October 22nd, 1844, Jesus switched from a purely intercessory ministry that was typified by a priest's ministry in the holy place of the ancient sanctuary to that of a pre-Advent judgment, which was foreshadowed by the time the high priest went into the most holy place of the Israelite sanctuary. He did that on the Day of Atonement only. To make things a little more confusing, Adventists sometimes use the term sanctuary message in different ways. Sometimes we refer to the larger message that encompasses all of Adventist theology, as Richard Davidson put it. Sometimes it's used euphemistically to refer to the investigative judgment specifically. Like when people say Desmond Ford attacked the sanctuary, oftentimes they mean specifically the investigative judgment. Desmond Ford was asked to address whether or not the investigative judgment aspect of the sanctuary message is warranted exegetically. Does the Bible really teach it? Is it really true? Or is it merely a historical tradition among Adventists to explain what happened on October 22nd, 1844? Now, since everybody and their brother ended up with an audio recording of Des's talk, I am excited that I get to play these clips for you. Before I get into the clips, I feel like every time in this episode I'm like, I get to play clips, and then I'm saying, well, before I do that, let me say something else. I'm going to outline his talk so that way you can understand how the various clips fit into Des's argument, because it is an hour-long talk. I'm not going to play the whole thing, of course. I should upload it. It probably is already uploaded on YouTube somewhere. Anyways, the investigative judgment teaching rested, I would say, on a venerable interpretive tradition of the Adventist pioneers who believed this doctrine and wrote on this topic. Within and alongside this tradition was Ellen White, who supported this understanding of an investigative judgment beginning in 1844. Okay? Any Adventist who wanted to challenge the investigative judgment on biblical grounds, as Des was about to do, is going to have to deal with the implications of challenging the investigative judgment. Implications like, if Ellen White was wrong about 1844, is she a false prophet? And if nothing happened in 1844, if that's what we're saying here, then is the Adventist movement a mistake? Are we wrong, in other words, to even exist? If Adventists are wrong about the 2300-year prophecy, which terminated in 1844, are they wrong about the other prophecies too? Now, these are big questions that might seem to unravel all of Adventism if you come to the conclusion that the investigative judgment was not biblical. I'm not trying to suggest that the biblical theology of the investigative judgment was not important or was not discussed. What I'm trying to say is the implications seemed much larger. Now, let me give you an example here. This is going to be a really, really poor example. But traditionally, Adventists have not been really big on jewelry and the wearing of jewelry. If Adventists are wrong about that and jewelry is okay, what are the implications? In my mind, hardly any. All right, so now you can put on jewelry. It doesn't threaten Adventism where you wear jewelry or don't wear jewelry. But it seemed to many, to most, that the investigative judgment was somehow integral to Adventism. that it wasn't so much the theology itself, it was the implications of removing it that were seen as very threatening. And so I think you have some people who will defend the investigative judgment, not because they personally deeply are convicted in its truth. Okay, of course they would say that they are, but mostly because they're afraid of what happens if you get rid of it. They're afraid of what happens if you seriously begin to question it. Where does that leave us? It's like taking a hammer at the foundation, at the pillars that are holding this thing up, and that's a scary thing to do because you don't know what's going to fall on your head if you do that. So I think some had this attitude of, it's just better to leave it alone. If you're going to doubt, keep your doubts to yourself. Don't take down this whole building that stands over our heads. I often joke that most Adventists today will still denounce you for denying the sanctuary message, but don't ask them to explain what the sanctuary message is. All right, this is my example of what I'm talking about here. That if you say, I no longer believe in the sanctuary message, someone's going to be upset. Someone's going to be upset. And they're going to think that you are a heretic or you're astray or whatever. But then you ask them, what is the sanctuary message? And you're going to get 10 different answers from 10 different people. Because the idea, the implications, I should say, of the sanctuary message are, to many, more important than the theology itself. Now, I'm not saying it should work that way or whatever. I'm just saying this is how I have experienced Adventism. This is my own personal encounter with these topics. So the reason why I bring all of this up before we get into these clips is because I think we need to understand what Des is trying to do in this presentation. When he gets up on October 27th, 1979, to tell his audience that the investigative judgment was not exegetically sound, that is, it's not biblically warranted in the way that Adventists had believed and taught it, he will then rush to prevent the falling of the dominoes, the implications from unraveling people's faith. Okay, so it's kind of like you have to you're trying to like pull the tablecloth out from underneath the dinner table or on top of the dinner table, right, without rattling all the plates and glasses. That's a little bit like what Des is trying to do with this presentation. He's trying to pull off this, what he sees as this stained or torn tablecloth, get it out of the way, but also not to disturb everything that has rested on top of it. He doesn't want to undermine people's Adventist faith, and he's very aware that if he's not careful, the implications of removing this, the implications of pulling this thread are people are just going to start wondering, then why am I here at all? If the investigative judgment isn't true, and if nothing happened in 1844, Ellen White's not a prophet, then the things she wrote are not necessarily true, and you just start unraveling, and then you wonder, why am I even here? He doesn't want that to happen. Des considered himself to be a good Adventist and made the case in this presentation, I think, that we could all remain good Adventists without the investigative judgment as it was understood. He still believed in a pre-Advent judgment, but not this theology of investigative judgment, which often, in the way that it was taught back then, often meant, you often heard phrases like, you don't know when your name's coming up in this judgment that's going on right now in heaven, and once your name is dealt with, your fate is sealed. And so it militated against people's sense of assurance. And so this is what Des is against here, among other things, okay? Des went a step further in his talk. He said, once we see that something is unbiblical, being a good Adventist means renouncing something that's unbiblical and aligning ourselves more faithfully with the Bible. So this wasn't about Des's personal theology. This isn't about, here's what I believe. He insisted that the whole church follow him in his conclusion. This was an incredibly difficult needle to thread. To say something the church, including Ellen White, has believed from the very beginning is wrong, but that doesn't mean the church is wrong about everything. One might even call it an impossible needle to thread, especially back then. Des began his talk by offering a little personal history. He invoked Hebrews 9, where the author talks about Jesus entering the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary after his ascension. I will say there's some debate about what the author of Hebrews 9 is actually saying. Is it the holy place or most holy place? To Des, the best way to translate it is the most holy place. And we're going to get into that in the next episode, by the way. This, of course, seemingly contradicted the Adventist idea that Jesus only entered the most holy place in 1844. Des noted that this contradiction of meanings has been a problem for him as far back as 1944, before he entered the Adventist Church. This question of the investigative judgment was a personal journey, not just a theological exercise for the fun of it. In other words, Des, in studying this, in presenting on this topic, is still in the process of working out, trying to reconcile what the Bible says with his Adventism. And so it is a very personal thing, but it's a personal journey he invites others to follow him on. Des then invoked Ellen White to invite his audience to make this brave journey. He quoted Ellen White as saying that, quote, "We can never honor God by erroneous opinions," end quote, and that Ellen White's quest for the truth is one of the reasons why he believed her to be a prophet. We must, he told the people, follow the truth regardless of the cost. The implication was, if we really believe in Ellen White, we need to be willing to follow the truth, no matter how much it hurts to change. Okay? So Des is saying, this is the journey I've been on, and by the way, Ellen White supports us following the truth wherever it leads us, and so we have to be willing to do this. Des then went into Adventist history. He shared vignettes of the men who also struggled over the sanctuary issue. We're talking about Ballinger, W.W. Fletcher, whom Des called one of the greatest Bible teachers in Adventist history. And the reason why I'm laughing about that is because one of his colleagues, Llewellyn Jones, somebody who, of course, is part of this Concerned Brethren crew back in Australia, who disagrees with Des, said, look, I took classes from Fletcher, and he was a great Bible teacher, but one of the greatest Bible teachers, Des, you met him for like 30 seconds on a train platform when you were younger. How can you call him one of the greatest Bible teachers? But anyways, that just amused me. Des talked about the Problems in Daniel Committee in the 1960s, which also wrestled with some of these issues. And then Des shared some letters he had received from pastors in the 1970s, pastors who were embarrassed by the investigative judgment. Once the history lesson got close to home, some in the audience might have been squirming in their seats. Now, Des paused to insist that he wasn't bringing up this heretic history in order to attack the church, but because he wanted the church to search for answers. Des says that this presentation is not a polemic against the church, but born from a desire that, quote, adequate answers might be forthcoming, end quote.
I know my objections are in the main not new, and that answers to these objections have been proffered in the past. However, there's a difference between an answer and a convincing answer.
An unconvincing answer was something not firmly based in the Bible, presumably. As Des put it,
we can't construct a doctrine on the fact that Edson had some sort of a conviction in a cornfield.
Of course, the doctrine didn't hinge on Hiram Edson's epiphany in the cornfield after the Great Disappointment. What was Des trying to do in bringing up this heretic history? That's what I'm calling it. It's not what he called it, of course. I believe he was trying to situate the problem that he was trying to address in historical terms. Sure, we may have a venerable tradition of interpreting the Bible to support the investigative judgment, but there's also a tradition of people questioning that interpretation. Now, this doesn't mean that Des endorsed all of those sanctuary critics. By bringing up their names, it doesn't mean he was on Fletcher's side or he was on Ballinger's side. He was only trying to point out that this sanctuary question, even if it was believed by a majority of members, has never been fully settled within Adventism. It was the majority position, of course, but it wasn't a unanimous position. It wasn't like the Sabbath. It wasn't like the state of the dead. It wasn't like, some of these other major doctrines in Adventism. There were key people in every generation who doubted it, whether they did so publicly or privately, whether they took it too far or went off into a weird angle or not. There were always people. Now, Des was here, 1979, basically saying there are exegetical problems with our sanctuary doctrine. People in every generation have seen some of these problems. Ellen White told us that we must pursue the truth at all costs. It is time to summon the courage to face the facts. By the way, Des made his own convictions clear, or maybe not clear, depending on how you look at these things.
Let me state my convictions, my personal convictions, before I go any further. I believe in a pre-Advent judgment with every man's destiny settled before the coming of Christ. I believe the Day of Atonement has a special application to Christ's last work, as prefigured by the work in the second department. I believe the Seventh-day Adventist movement was raised up in 1844 by God to do a special work, and that to it was restored the gift of prophecy in the person of Ellen G. White. There, for the record, they are my true convictions.
Des didn't deny that there was a pre-Advent judgment, that is, that Jesus had to judge folks before he can return a second time. How else would he know who he is coming to take home if he didn't do a little judgment before he came? Who are the sheep? Who are the goats? He has to decide before he comes. That's a pre-Advent judgment. Des even said he believes in a Day of Atonement at the end of time, that 1844 is indeed a significant date, that Ellen White was a prophet, and so on. What he's saying here is that you can deny the investigative judgment and still be a good Adventist. Of course, some of you might wonder then, if Des believes all these things, what exactly is he denying? Because his personal convictions that he just told us about sure sound like those of a traditional Adventist. Llewellyn Jones, I mentioned him just a minute ago, wondered the same thing, calling Ford's statement here mere casuistry, and doubted Des's honesty in saying these things. Llewellyn Jones' statement reflected the constant frustration many had with figuring out exactly what Desmond Ford believed. And we quoted, I quoted, who's the we? It's a royal we. We quoted, Keith Parmenter in the last episode, I believe, writing a letter to Des saying, what exactly do you believe? Put it in writing for us. And it's not that Des was unclear. He wrote a lot. He talked a lot. He has a whole commentary at this point on Daniel. And I want to say his Revelation one, it had just been written, but I don't think it was out yet. Okay, but he's got a lot of material out. Lots of tapes, lots of books, lots of articles, lots of talks that he's given. So you wonder, how can people not understand what he actually believes? And I think it's because when he says something like, as he just told us, that I believe the Seventh-day Adventist movement was raised up in 1844 by God to do a special work, what does that mean when you don't believe in the 2300 days? What does that mean when you don't believe in the investigative judgment? It sounds like what an Adventist who believes in those things would say. But how is what you believe different? And so some will say, did he mean the same things others meant when he used the same words others used? And I think that's the key question behind the confusion. When a typical Adventist says, I believe the Seventh-day Adventist movement was raised up in 1844, in their mind, they're thinking, yeah, because the 2300 days expired. This is the time when Jesus went from the holy place to the most holy place, and God raised up a people at the same time to proclaim the three angels' message, yada, yada, yada. That's what a traditionalist would understand by that statement. But what did Des mean by that statement when he doesn't believe in the investigative judgment as other Adventists understood it, when he doesn't believe in the 2300 days as other Adventists understood it? The words are the same that any Adventist would say. But what does he mean by it? And so people get frustrated with Des because they say, you're using the same words other people use, but we don't know that you're meaning the same things that other people mean by those words. We're going to talk about this a little bit more in the next episode, I'm sure. Des went on to say that there are good scholars out there, non-Adventist scholars, who were writing things that support the Adventist position. Des mentioned one who wrote that Antiochus Epiphanes cannot be the only fulfillment of Daniel 8, and that Daniel 8:14, which was this crucial text about the 2300 days, it does speak to some end-time judgment. And I think Des's point was that, hey, if only Adventists would respect and read these other non-Adventist scholars, they would find more scholarly support than they think. So before Des gives all of his objections of what's wrong with the investigative judgment, he wanted to take a little bit of time to affirm his own faith, to quote some Ellen White, basically along the lines of, we need to have courage to follow the truth, and also to say, look, there are some scholars out there who are saying some of the things that we're saying, and so Adventists it's not that, we're wrong in all of our prophetic interpretations. No, even other scholars are recognizing areas where we may be correct. Even if they're not, specifically saying the Adventists are correct. They're taking positions that Adventists could be comfortable with. And so I'm not here to destroy our confidence in prophecy. In fact, we have a lot of views that are affirmed by non-Adventist scholarship. So it's not that we're all wrong, okay? So that's kind of his shaping operation here. He's trying to lay the groundwork. He's trying to build the foundation for his criticisms so that it doesn't sound like he's here to just tear everything down. All right. With that said, Des outlines the exegetical and theological problems with the investigative judgment, among other things, actually. What are those problems? Here we go. First, Des insists that Jesus could have returned in the first century, according to Matthew 24:34, where Jesus says that this generation will not pass away until all these things are fulfilled. And since in Matthew 24, Jesus was talking about some of these last day events, then the implication of that passage is, in that generation, Jesus could have returned. And if Jesus could have returned in the first century, then obviously there could be no time prophecy that stretched to 1844. Likewise, there is no year-day principle in the Bible, where a prophecy is said to go on for 1,260 days, but really this represents 1,260 years. Des did claim that this happens occasionally in the Bible, but it isn't a principle. And even if it were, Adventists don't apply it consistently. Des alluded to Don Neufeld's column in the Review, which appeared 6 months earlier, where Don tackled this problem of Matthew 24:34. And Don writes, quote, "Some have felt that Numbers 14:34 and Ezekiel 4:6 established the year-day principle as needing to be applied to all time prophecies. But a careful examination of these passages shows that the principle is applied only to specific cases and that there is no general statement in these passages suggesting a universal principle is set forth. In fact, Seventh-day Adventists do not apply the principle consistently to all time prophecies," end quote. All right, that's a mouthful. What does Don Neufeld mean by that? Well, his example was that when Adventists get to the millennium in Revelation, they don't interpret the 1,000 years of the millennium as, say, 365,000 years or 360,000 years, depending on what calendar you're going off of. Now, I think personally that example misses the point that he's trying to make, because that time period is not expressed as 1,000 days. It's a millennium. It's already 1,000 years. Adventists don't typically take years and turn them into, I guess, more years. It's usually just, as the principle or whatever, the tool is described, it is a day for year, not a year for day or a year for year mechanism. Neufeld did cite Ellen White's comment that God's prophecies are often conditional, and this is his explanation of Matthew 24:34. He might have returned in the first century. He is okay with that. But when Jesus did not return in the first century, Neufeld implies, suddenly these prophecies that were spoken of in terms of days are reimagined in terms of years. Neufeld notes that Leroy Froome had concluded that, quote, "the year-day principle was not understood until about the 9th century," end quote. So in other words, after Jesus did not appear, people went back to the Bible and started to realize maybe these prophecies that are talking about days actually mean years, and that's the only way to make sense of why Jesus hasn't come, because there's still work that needs to be done. And Froome making that point about the 9th century, it mirrors exactly, of course, what Adventists claimed that they were doing in the 19th century. That is, Jesus didn't come in 1844. Let's go back to the drawing board. Let's go back to the Bible, figure out what happened. What did we not understand here? So Ford accepts that that occasionally there are prophecies where a day represents a year, but it's not a principle in the sense that it needs to be applied consistently to all prophecies. I would imagine they would say that context dictates how this prophecy is to be applied. And the reason why this was important for them, like, why are we arguing about this, right? The reason why this is important, because if Jesus could have returned in the first century, there obviously could not be a prophecy that lasted until 1844. So to Neufeld and Ford, they're not throwing away the year-day principle. They are downgrading it from a principle to, say, a provisional tool. And thus, Jesus could have come back in the first century when he didn't. I don't know exactly where they would go with this, but maybe then we're entitled to interpret the 2300 days as years, and therefore it leads to 1844. But they were first and foremost originally intended to be understood as days. It was a conditional prophecy. Otherwise, Jesus could not have returned in the first century, and thus, how do you interpret Matthew 24:34, right? So they're trying to be more biblically faithful. They're adjusting terms, and they're adjusting how Adventists understand these things in a way that, in their mind, allows them to be more biblically faithful. Okay, so let's not act as Adventists like we were God's plan A. We were kind of a plan B or a C, or however many times Jesus wanted to come back before 1844. So that's the first argument Des makes, that Jesus could have returned before 1844, and therefore we need to understand the 2300 days, and we need to understand the day for year principle more as like the pirate code. It's more of a guideline. The second thing Des says is, he moves to Daniel 8. He tackles the little horn, not literally tackling the little horn, of course, but that would be cool to watch. Can someone with some AI account work on that image for us? Thank you. This is what Des says.
And the question is asked, how long will this wicked power defile the sanctuary? And Adventists, in answering it, forget about the sins of the wicked power and start talking about the sins of the saints.
What Des means here is that the contextual question of Daniel 8 is not how can the sins of God's people be cleansed as on the Day of Atonement, but how long before the wicked little horn power stops standing in God's sanctuary and polluting it by his presence. His point here is that Adventists assume when Daniel 8:14 talks about the cleansing of the sanctuary, that Adventists assume that the reason why the sanctuary is polluted is because of the sins of God's people that need to be atoned for. Whereas for Des, the context there is that there is this wicked power whose very presence in the temple, in the sanctuary, pollutes it. So the question of cleansing the sanctuary is really the question of getting this wicked little horn power out of the sanctuary. Now, his second observation is that the Adventist interpretation of Daniel 8:14 is based on a mistranslation. The angel tells Daniel that the sanctuary will be polluted unto 2,300 days, and then shall the sanctuary be cleansed. Des notes that the word translated cleansed there in Hebrew doesn't actually mean cleansed. And taking these 2 points about Daniel 8 together, Des doesn't think Daniel 8:14 is truly connected to the Day of Atonement, to that ancient Hebrew festival where the Israelites, I guess in the language of the King James, this is how I first learned about these things, they afflicted their souls as the high priest went and entered the most holy place on their behalf, and at the end of the day, they were atoned for, and da-da-da-da-da. This is how Adventists have typically understood Daniel 8:14, and Des is saying, I don't think this has anything to do with the Day of Atonement at all. This is not a cleansing of the sanctuary. This has nothing to do with the forgiveness of the sins of God's people. This has everything to do with stopping this little horn power whose presence pollutes the temple, and there's no word there no word should be translated as cleansed. Okay, the third problem Des brings up, the one Des considered to be the real problem, as he put it, was of course Hebrews 9.
Let me underline it again, because you must get this point. The book of Hebrews distinctly teaches that Christ went directly into the most holy place at his ascension. There is no way out, round, or through it. I have ransacked every nook and corner and twisted every syllable. There is no way out or round or through it. The book of Hebrews chapter 9 teaches that Christ went directly into the most holy place at his ascension. Every commentary in the world has seen it, my friends, except one or two by Seventh-day Adventists.
To summarize, Desmond Ford outlined problems in 3 areas of the Bible: Hebrews 9, Daniel 8, Matthew 24. To Des, Jesus' statement in Matthew 24 shows that these long-time prophecies were conditional, not absolute. To Des, 2 problems in Daniel 8 show that Adventists have mistakenly associated that text with the Day of Atonement, and they've missed the point of the passage, which is about getting some wicked power out of the sanctuary, not about judging God's people and cleansing them of sin. And of course, to Des, Hebrews 9 is the biggest nail in the coffin of the investigative judgment, because if Jesus metaphorically entered the most holy place after his resurrection, and ascension, then he couldn't have first entered that space in 1844. Therefore, no investigative judgment foreshadowed by the ancient Day of Atonement could now be going on in heaven. Now, let me just say something here. It's my job. It's my job. I gave myself this job, so I get to define my job. It's my job to present Desmond Ford's paper as clearly as I can so you can understand not only what he's saying, but why he thought it made sense. And I always try to treat my subjects sympathetically, no matter who I'm talking about, whether I agree with them or not, unless, of course, it's Judson Washburn or Claude Holmes. Those two can go fly a kite. Occasionally, I feel the need to remind my dear listeners that just because I'm doing my best to explain Desmond Ford to you doesn't mean I am personally endorsing his views. I also realize that when you hear me make his case in my authoritative, trustworthy voice, that sounds a little bit like Moses on Mount Sinai. It can be tempting to say, yeah, that sounds right. Speaking of authoritative voices, rest in peace, James Earl Jones. Lots have been written on this subject, so I would invite you, if you're interested in the theology here, to go and read Ford's Glacier View manuscript. Go and read the Darcom series of books, especially Richard Davidson's book, his recent book, Song for the Sanctuary, if you want to go deeper into the theology here. There's been a million things written on this subject, okay? I am here to present Ford sympathetically because I think that's how we learn things. This is why I love history, because I get to step in people's shoes and see the world through their eyes and explain it and how it makes sense to them. And, also to offer some context that gives us some perspective on whether or not this person's view is the only view, right? Like, how did other people see the same events? We've been doing that in this episode as well. But generally, we're following Desmond Ford. We're walking in his shoes, seeing things through his eyes, and occasionally from the eyes of those who are around him as well. Okay? I'm only concerned with history. I'm not trying to steer you one way or the other, and I'm only trying to include as much theology as I need to in order to tell the story. All right. Just trying to forestall my heresy trial. As I said earlier, the real battleground for this issue was not the exegesis, but the implications. If Des was right, then is Ellen White a fraud? Is there any point of being Adventist? All of these sort of things. After laying out the objections, Des quickly moves to anticipate the objections his audience might have. Des knew the question that he was bound to hear because it was the question he's been hearing for a long time now whenever he presents anything even close to this.
What shall we say about it? Well, the first thing that I must say is an answer to what you will say. But Ellen White.
Des, of course, goes on to effusively praise Ellen White, calling her Desire of Ages, quote, the greatest book in the world next to Scripture, end quote. When he quoted from her book Acts of the Apostles, he said that he wished he had written that book. It was so good. He breezily dismissed charges of plagiarism. You might recall that Walter Ray's charges of plagiarism of Ellen White had emerged in the L.A. Times just 4 days before Des's Forum talk.
All this talk about Ellen White's plagiarism, sure, she used other books in preparing this book. She used Hannah, and used Dr. Harris, and she used Edersheim, and she used Farrer, and she used Daniel Marsh, and she used a number of other books. Sure, she did. But my friends, those books are open for anyone. I don't see them coming up with a Desire of Ages. The issue isn't did Ellen White use sources, it's what use did she make of them? What did she come up with?
Of course, plagiarism had nothing to do with the sanctuary. One gets the distinct impression that Des was going out of his way to affirm his belief in Ellen White in order to shield himself from those charges of contradicting Ellen White. But it wasn't all bluster. He attempted to show that Ellen White was really on his side of this issue. He quoted her as saying that Jesus had entered the most holy place after his ascension. Des didn't give the reference during the talk, at least I don't believe he did, but I found it on page 33 of Acts of the Apostles, where Ellen White notes that just as the high priest laid aside his, what she calls, pontifical robes, and took on the simple white linen tunic, so Christ became a human being. Des's point was that, see, Jesus must have served as a high priest before 1844 because he laid aside those robes when he came to become a human being and walk among us. Des also praised Ellen White with the same word many were applying to him.
And please note that Ellen White here, as in many other places, is a rebel. The greatest rebel we've ever had amongst us was Ellen White. Praise God. No other Adventist writer would have dared to write some of the things she wrote. I'm so glad she wrote them. They convinced me that she was led of the Spirit of God in the way that you and I have not been led.
Adding it all up, Ellen White supported the idea that Jesus entered the most holy place long before 1844, that she was something of a rebel that fearlessly corrected the other pioneers at times, and, of course, that she's a prophet. In other words, Ellen White was largely on Desmond Ford's side. Of course, he didn't deal with the many, many passages that could be cited where Ellen White affirmed the traditional Adventist views of 1844 and the investigative judgment. In early writings, page 253, for instance, Ellen White wrote, quote, "As the priest entered the most holy once a year to cleanse the earthly sanctuary, so Jesus entered the most holy of the heavenly at the end of the 2300 days of Daniel 8 in 1844 to make a final atonement for all who could be benefited by his mediation and thus to cleanse the sanctuary." End quote. Now, of course, Des was not ignorant of these statements, but there wasn't enough time to deal with all of them, okay? He's got 1 hour here to make a presentation. He hinted, however, at how he might respond when presented with these kinds of statements, when he said,
I marvel at the way Ellen White was not afraid to go right against Adventist traditions, right against some things apparently she'd written herself.
In other words, Ellen White could sometimes correct her previous writings as she learned and grew. He might very well have said that early writings was, represented an immature stage in Ellen White, and as she grew, she might have written things differently, as she did correct herself from time. And by the way, we do have some evidence of this, not necessarily of saying, "Oh, I was wrong about this doctrine," but when she would soften language or change language as she grew and write about things and about people differently. For instance, you look at the 1888 Great Controversy compared to the 1911 Great Controversy, and she softened her language about Roman Catholics from one edition to the next, even if she didn't change her theological views there. Des, I think, is saying something a little bit different than what I'm saying, in that she could correct past ideas that were wrong, not merely changing the language she uses, but correcting the ideas themselves. Of course, this leads to the implications. How does one know what is true then? If Ellen White wrote something the day she died, how do you know it's true? Because if she had lived longer, maybe she would have corrected that too. So what was truly from the Lord in Ellen White's writings, and what was provisional in her writings? Like, this was true as far as she knew, but given enough time, she might revise it later. Even some of Des's supporters were unimpressed by his attempt to suggest that Ellen White might have supported the idea that Jesus entered the most holy place after his ascension. One pastor, who apparently also had a law degree, stated that he wouldn't go to trial with Ford's evidence from Ellen White, but that Ford was on stronger grounds biblically. Ford repeated his oft-used phrase that Ellen White's role in the church is pastoral, not canonical. Pastors can err, but the cumulative effect of their ministry should be to lead the flock towards God, which Des believed Ellen White had done.
Inspiration is not inerrancy. Ellen White says, as for infallibility, I've never claimed it. The Bible is the only source of truth, she says, unmixed with error, which suggests that even the writings of the non-canonical prophets, my friends, were not inerrant. As a matter of fact, if you apply a strict rule, even the writings of the Bible are not inerrant. And if that sounds blasphemous, that is our official position, which doesn't make it right, but it makes it respectable. The Church's official position is that the Bible is not inerrant. It is reliable, it's an infallible rule of doctrine, but we've never ever taught inerrancy.
Des also went on to talk about the signs the Millerites and early Adventists pointed to, the Lisbon earthquake, the stars falling in the sky in 1833, and so on. Des said the Scripture is speaking about cosmic phenomena happening in the very end of time. Those things that Adventists point to, the Lisbon earthquake and so on, were merely previews of a future fulfillment, a much larger fulfillment to come the closer we get to the end. Take a minute. Catch your breath, because Des just raced through a bunch of topics we all might wish he could have expanded upon if he had more time. The problem with trying to touch on all of these topics was that it surely left people with more questions than answers. If his goal was to reassure people, reassure them in Ellen White's gift, and ultimately to reassure them in Desmond Ford's own orthodoxy that I'm not sure how lightly touching on a variety of subjects that were controversial and raising more questions than answers would actually help him achieve that goal. Desmond Ford also revised how he saw the Day of Atonement. He emphasized that last word, atonement, to say that its true meaning pointed us towards the cross, where Jesus made atonement for us. Of course, it also pointed forward to what he called the final application of Calvary in the judgment. If Adventists would just preach the gospel and stop distracting themselves with other ideas and pointless debates, then Jesus could come. And this explained his own emphasis on the gospel and why he couldn't be dismissed as ignoring eschatology, that is, last-day events. For Des, the one thing that truly mattered was proclaiming the gospel, and that's what the second coming was waiting on. Not for us to perfect our character, not for us to finally get rid of all the jewelry, but for us to simply accept the gospel and tell others about it. And after an hour of this presentation, he summarized his message.
So to apply Daniel 8:14 just to 1844 only, my friend, is to misunderstand it entirely. It points to the great judgment that seals every man's destiny before the coming of Christ as they respond to the cross.
The editor of Ministry, Bob Spangler, felt personal affection for Ford and appreciated aspects of Ford's theology. He noted that Ford said his goal of that his goal at the Forum presentation was to help counteract the work of Brinsmead's book 1844 Re-Examined. We talked about that in the last episode. That book had just come out. But Spangler was puzzled by statements like the one Des just made. Quote, how could his presentation on October 27th be intended to answer the attack this group, it means Brinsmead, was making on the church when their views are seemingly so compatible, end quote. Des had said that 1844, as a reminder of the Day of Atonement, should point us back to the moment of atonement on the cross. Brinsmead wrote that, quote, Daniel 8:14 points to the time of the restoration of the everlasting gospel, end quote. Like I said, Daniel 8:14, 2300 days, Day of Atonement, it should be pointing us towards the gospel. It's very similar to what Ford had just said. So how Bob Spangler wants to know, could this Forum presentation be seen as a reaction or a way of distancing Ford's self from Brinsmead when the central thesis was in agreement? And of course, it didn't help that afterwards Brinsmead began sending out loads of tapes of Desmond Ford's Forum presentation here, just kind of giving evidence to the accusation that these two were in league with one another. Or at least, maybe not giving evidence, but not doing anything to stop that perception. Let's just put it that way. And then, in a prophetic nod to his own fate, Des added the final words of his presentation.
It was a good American that said, God offers every man, and I might add every movement, truth or repose.
It was Ford's Diet of Worms stand. You can either bravely embrace the truth, as Ford believed he had done, or choose comfort, ignorance, indifference. After Ford was done, Eric Syme got up to give his response. Syme's response has generally been ignored, is not having a great degree of historical value. Gillian Ford would later write that Syme essentially, in her words, conceded defeat. Desmond would later write that, quote, those who heard the tape know he supported me strongly, end quote. A doctor later wrote to Jack Castle complaining about Syme's apparent sympathy with Ford, asking, quote, can you imagine a debate between a Republican and a Democrat in which the Democrats choose both speakers in the debate, end quote. What these accounts leave out, and what Desmond may not be aware of, or have not been aware of, was not aware of, there we go, we're going to find our tenses here, Matthew, is that Adrian Zykowski, one of the organizers, had passed a note to Eric Syme in the middle of Dez's presentation. So I don't know exactly where they were all sitting. I assume they were sitting behind Des. Passes a note. Des undoubtedly did not see it, and I don't know if he learned about it afterwards. This note read, quote, Eric, there are some fairly powerful people who are prepared to crucify Des on this issue and drum him out of the church. If there is any way in your response, even if you disagree strongly with his interpretations, that you can demonstrate your solidarity with scholarship in the church and your support of him personally so as not to give aid and comfort to those who want to push him out, it would be helpful. The only reason I am writing this is to let you know the intensity of the opposition. Adrian. End quote. How much did this note alter what Eric Syme had planned to say? Now, it's doubtful that Syme had really planned to blast Des's presentation. By all accounts, Syme didn't see why both sides were all worked up. In particular, Syme agreed with Des's statement that the greatest way to undo Ellen White was to overdo Ellen White. But it is possible that the note caused Syme to soften his response to Des, giving the impression that he had conceded defeat. The note was a political twist on what was meant to be a scholarly enterprise, and we will never understand the effect, if any, it had on that pivotal night. Syme made some of his own views very clear in the aftermath to Arthur White. He doubled down on his frustrations with how Ellen White was used. Quote, "We teachers are constantly dealing with students who have been taught to neglect the Bible and then misquote Ellen White." End quote. Like Des, Syme saw the misuse of Ellen White in the church as more dangerous than accusations of plagiarism. Like Des, Syme still believed she had a prophetic gift. When it came to the sanctuary in 1844, Syme denied that it was his and Des's positions to make nothing of 1844, as he put it. Quote, "We are not following the Ballinger heresy." End quote. There was time for questions, many of which I think centered around Ellen White. But the PUC student who attended left the chapel to go call Herb Douglas and let him know what had happened. After reading his notes to Herb, the student described Douglas as practically in tears. The next day, the student called a classmate on the third floor of the dorm. The classmate said, quote, "Boy, if this isn't the shaking, I don't know what is." End quote. PUC's president, Jack Castle, was in Singapore on a recruiting trip to find more students. A tape of Ford's presentation found him there, and he arrived back on campus on November 18th, although some sources have said November 16th, to be greeted by the reaction. Retired ministers in the area gathered to grumble, just as they had in Australia. Some parents wrote letters complaining about Ford's talk. Another letter from Arthur White also found its way to Castle, and as you can imagine, he was not terribly pleased. Castle and other administrators would have to endure a withering barrage of letters, sermons, and other forms of attack by concerned Adventists who picked everything apart, and I mean everything. One of the so-called Friends of PUC groups asked an administrator, what's PUC's mission? And then when the administrator apparently did not answer clearly or quickly enough, a letter then appeared claiming that PUC doesn't even know what it's about anymore. On top of all of that, the St. Helena Star ran the headline, quote, "PUC caught in middle of Adventist schism," end quote. Castle, who had boasted to Wayne Judd, you will remember, that PUC could handle Ford while Australia settled down, was now in the position that many had predicted. That is, that Australia had not settled down, and that PUC could not handle Desmond Ford. Now he had to solve this problem. In a memo to Prexad, and you'll recall Prexad was General Conference President Neil Wilson's Executive Advisory Committee, Castle saw two terrible options before him. First, he could fire Ford, which would be seen as clamping down on academic freedom and suppressing the truth. It also wouldn't settle the raging controversy. Second, he could keep Ford, which would be seen as teaching heresy and imperiling the college's reputation, perhaps mortally. Castle believed that Ford had erred, even if he still largely agreed with Ford's teaching on the gospel. Academic freedom must be met, he said, by academic responsibility, and in Castle's belief, Ford had been irresponsible in presenting this topic to that audience. After 2 years of carefully avoiding crossing a red line, Ford had finally crossed it. In a letter to the school board, Ford was described as having offered, quote, "a public challenge to key doctrines and teachings of the church," end quote. Ford himself would later regret airing those grievances before such a large crowd. They were meant, as you will recall, for a smaller, more academic setting, but things had escalated so fast, and while the crowd had grown and the venue quickly changed, there was no time to change the presentation. And that's why I said earlier, I don't think Ford really was expecting such a large crowd, because otherwise, I think he would have written a different presentation for the crowd. But because he was anticipating speaking to one small group of people, and then in the course of minutes, it escalated to speaking somewhere else to a much larger, much different crowd. The only thing that didn't change was the presentation itself. About a week after returning from Asia, Jack Castle headed to the General Conference to hammer out a plan. Castle wanted to save PUC and, if he could, save Ford as well. But there was no denying that the man who had preached salvation by faith alone now needed to be saved by somebody's works. And Jack Castle intended to work. The plan Castle managed to hammer out with his board was for Ford to be placed on a 6-month leave of absence, effective December 15th, 1979. Castle recommended to Prexad that Ford have time to write out what he really believes on the investigative judgment, as if it's not clear by this point, and offer it to the Biblical Research Institute or maybe the White Estate so they could conduct, well, an investigative judgment to determine if he was teaching heresy. Castle thought this is a good plan, and, if Ford truly had new light, then this is how we should deal with these claims of new light. And I get the impression, I should say, that Castle really thought he was contributing something here to the way these situations have been handled in the past, which, if you've listened to any number of episodes in this podcast, these situations often don't go well. The 6-month thing is pretty standard. People are given 6 months to form their views and to write them out and all that. But who do you present them to? What's the process for judging whether somebody is correct or not? None of this stuff is really hammered out. And so I think Castle here was trying to find a way to say, look, we haven't really dealt with Ford. We haven't really given him some kind of formal process for his views to be heard and a chance for them to be accepted. And so we need, he saw what his recommendation to Prexad as, I guess, a way of achieving that, a way of establishing a precedent where future claims at having the truth could follow, and without all the drama unnecessarily. But I will confess that I'm not exactly sure how Castle's plan materially differs from the previous way these things have been handled. 2 days later, Prexad voted, after what Walter Utt called a vigorous debate, to largely accept PUC's proposal. I will say, I'm talking about Castle here. It is Castle and his board and his dean, together with the Pacific Union Conference, the union. They also came to the GC to talk to Prexad. Anyway, so they accepted it, largely. They largely accepted it. People in Ford's shoes were often given 6 months, as I said, to appear before a group of leaders who would hear their case. Ford himself had been on the other end of those meetings. The exact committee that would meet to hear Ford was to be determined, TBD. This was the supreme political question during the winter and spring of 1980. Who will hear Desmond Ford? And Walter Utt appreciated the difficulty of this. As he put it, if there are too many people on this committee who are Ford's allies, accusations of heresy will spread to other schools, and I would add, perhaps even to the General Conference itself. If there are too many of Ford's enemies on this roster, then the accusation will be that Ford never got a fair hearing. So how do you populate this group of people who will hear Ford? It can't just be, let's take half the people who agree with him and half the people who don't. There has to, your only qualification for being on this should not be whether or not you agree or disagree with Ford, right? There has to be some kind of formal qualification to adjudicate in this manner. You have to have, some background of Hebrew or Greek. You're a biblical scholar, you're a historian, you're even an administrator who can figure out what's the best way forward here. So in populating that group, you're trying to find people who are qualified, but you also don't want to find, you can't be insensitive to the political aspect of this, right? And so that's what made this such a thorny thing, because you could just choose a bunch of GC people and some scholars and then What's the point of it, though, if people don't trust the verdict that they render? If people don't trust their decision at the end? And would there even be a verdict at the end? Exactly how would this go? We don't know. But Ford agreed with this plan. Some at PUC were unnerved that Ford had been plucked from his classroom midterm and summoned to the General Conference. They feared what this might mean for academic freedom in the future. Can any of us just be spirited away from our classroom? Some compared it to Martin Luther being summoned to Rome, a rumor Fred Veltman tried to squash. For his part, Ford gave no hint of disagreement with the plan. He walked his Via Dolorosa from Angwin to Tacoma Park. Whatever happened next, Ford was no longer PUC's problem. Jack Castle had invited Ford, thinking that PUC and its community were strong enough to contain the controversy, that Ford himself would do his best to not provoke his opponents, and that perhaps the PUC campus and community would even benefit from having Ford there. But in trying to disarm that bomb, it had blown up in Jack Castle's face. And now, it was time for the General Conference to try and disarm the bomb themselves. Let's see if they have better luck. Spoiler alert, they don't. Well, I'll see you guys next episode. Thanks so much for listening.